السلام عليك يا حجة الله في أرضه السلام عليك يا عين الله في خلقه السلام عليك يا نور الله الذي يهتدي به المهتدي.
بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. This is our second discussion on this topic of Mahdawiyyah. Yesterday we began this discussion and I'd like to carry on with the same topic of ghaiba. So Mahdawiyyah, if you remember, is the discussion of the theology and eschatology surrounding the Imam al-Mahdi, and also the history of what took place during his lesser and his greater occultation, or minor and major occultation. One thing I just wanted to clarify or correct from yesterday, when I was reading the Hadith al-Lawh, the tradition of the tablet that Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari was able to see in Lady Fatima's possession, the hadith, as it's narrated in Al-Kafi, mentions 3 Alis and 3 Muhammads that he saw in the list of the successors of the Imams. And on the go, when I was trying to think of the numbers, I thought that there needed to be some adjustment because it's not 3 and 3, it's actually 3 and 4, right? So there actually, there's either a mistake in that particular narration. The commentators tell us that probably some of the scribes mistakenly wrote 3 Alis when it should be 4 Alis instead of the 3. In other traditions that we have, in other transmissions of the same hadith from Jabir, it tells us that there are 4 Alis and 3 Muhammads, of course, as we know. Now, yesterday we talked about many things, particularly about the ghaiba. And what I'd like to do today is to just recap very quickly, because one of the things that we said yesterday that gives us confidence in the beliefs that we as Imami Shi'as have in Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif, is the fact that the beliefs around him are actually unanimously agreed upon and accepted by all groups of Muslims. So I'd like to share with you, Sheikh Jafar Subhani in his Ilahiyat has collected from some of the primary sources of hadith of the Ahlul Sunnah. He's collected just a sample of ahadith that they have narrated about Imam al-Mahdi. And we'll see that they're actually identical or very similar to ahadith that we have from the Ahlul Bayt. So I'll just share these 5 hadith with you. The first of these is from the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, where it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi said, لَوْ لَمْ يَبْقَ مِنَ الدَّهْرِ إِلَّا يَوْمٌ وَاحِدٌ لَبَعَثَ اللَّهُ رَجُلًا مِنْ أَهْلِ بَيْتِي يَمْلَأُهَا عَدْلًا كَمَا مُلِئَتْ جَوْرًا. The Prophet said that if it were the case that out of the time that Allah has appointed for the world, only 1 day remained, then Allah would raise up and send a man from my Ahlul Bayt who would fill the world with justice as it was filled with injustice. A second hadith, this is from the Sunan of Abi Dawood, also quotes from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, لا تذهب or لا تنقضي الدنيا حتى يملك العرب رجل من أهل بيتي يواطئ اسمه اسمي. And so he says that this dunya will not fade, will not end until a man from my Ahlul Bayt rules over the earth whose name agrees with my name. Meaning his name is the same as my name. A third tradition also from the Sunan of Abi Dawood, from Salama radiallahu anha, salamullahi alayha, is سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله يقول المهدي من عترتي من ولد فاطمة. That the Mahdi will be from my progeny, from the children of Fatima, salamullahi alayha. A fourth tradition from the Sunan of At-Tirmidhi says, يلي رجل من أهل بيتي يواطئ اسمه اسمي. That a man from my Ahlul Bayt will have authority, will rule, Yali from Wilaya, will rule whose name agrees with my name. And one last one quotes a khutbah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and this is in the Sunan of Ibn Majah. So the narrator says, خطبنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فكان أكثر خطبته حديثا حدثناه عن الدجال. He says that one day the Prophet ﷺ was delivering a sermon to us, and most of his sermon comprised talk about the Dajjal. وَحَذَّرَنَاهُ, and he warned us about the Dajjal. فكان من قوله إنه لم تكن فتنة في الأرض منذ ذرأ الله ذرية آدم أعظم من فتنة الدجال. In the course of what he was talking about, he said that there has never been a trial or tribulation in this world since the time that Allah created Adam alayhi salam, greater than the fitna that will be caused by this creature, this character named Ad-Dajjal. Then he continues and says, وَإِمَامُهُمْ رَجُلٌ صَالِحٌ. The Imam of the believers will be a righteous man. فَبَيْنَمَا إِمَامُهُمْ قَدْ تَقَدَّمَ لِيُصَلِّي بِهِمُ الصُّبْحِ. When their Imam advances to pray Salatul Subh, Salatul Fajr in front of them as their Imam, إِذْ نَزَلَ عَلَيْهِمْ عِيسَى بْنُ مَرْيَمَ. At that point, Prophet Isa alayhi salam will descend upon them. فَرَجَعَ ذَلِكَ الْإِمَامُ يَنْكُسُ يَمْشِ الْقَهْقَرَى. The Imam who had advanced to lead the prayer will retreat, right? He'll walk backwards, he'll retreat. لِيَقْدُمَ عِيسَى لِيُصَلِّي بِالنَّاسِ. To allow Isa to come and lead the people in the prayer. فَيَضَعُ عِيسَى يَدَهُ بَيْنَ كَتِفَيْهِ ثُمَّ يَقُولُ لَهُ. Isa alayhi salam will place his hand between the shoulders of the man, the Mahdi, and say, تَقَدَّمْ فَصَلِّ. Please, you advance and you lead the prayer. فَإِنَّهَا لَكَ أُقِيمَتْ. The prayer has been established for you, right? Not for me. فَيُصَلِّ بِهِمْ إِمَامُهُمْ. So the Imam Mahdi alayhi salam will lead the prayers at that point. So this is a sampling of some ahadith from Sunni sources that describe the Imam, some of the roles that he'll play, and you see that they are things that agree almost completely with ahadith that we have from the Ahlul Bayt on the same topic. And so this is one of those things that gives us great confidence. It's not simply the evidence that we have from the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt through ahadith, which would be sufficient in and of itself, but sometimes a doubt comes in that, maybe this is something that, God forbid, somehow we have created, or we have somehow reverse engineered something to suit our own needs. But then when we see others, especially people who don't have the same interest, who have a contrary interest to us, also touting the same thing, also teaching the same thing, then it gives us a little bit more confidence. It dispels some of those satanic doubts that enter into our mind. Basically the only difference that we see in the Sunni belief around the Imam and the Shi'i belief is in the identity of who he is, and in the fact that as Shia, we know that he was already born, and he is the 12th Imam, and he's the son of Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam. Whereas in the Sunni understanding of these ahadith, they expect that this person will be born at some later time, at the time when he is almost ready to fulfill these prophecies. At that time, Allah will have him be born, and then he'll grow up and he'll fulfill all of these things. Right? So that's basically the only difference. The other ideas that we have about who he is, what his role will be, what things will happen around his appearance and his advent are almost identical. Now, one thing I want to do, let's go back because I left one question yesterday unanswered, and I need to address that question. We spoke about the idea that one of the arguments that we level at Ahlus Sunnah is that when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, they say that the divine guidance ended. Now we have the Quran, we have an archive of what the Prophet said and did, and that's sufficient for us. And now it's up to us to figure out what to do from here on out. And as Shia, we say that that's not the case. That is not the way that Allah has ever acted. He's always provided guides continuously from the time of Adam until the time of the Prophet, and that Sunnah will continue. وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. But then what is the difference if the Sunnis are considering that that connection with divine guidance ends in the year 11 after the Hijrah, the passing of the Prophet, and we as Imami Shi'as are saying that that same connection through the Ghaiba has now ended in the year 260 when Imam al-Hujjah enters into his Ghaiba Kubra, the major occultation. So is there any difference? Are we not simply deferring that separation between ourselves and divine guidance for these 200 and almost 50 years? Is it not the same thing though in terms of being cut off from guidance? Well, we talked about already that preparation was made, prophecies were made, decisions were made at the level of Allah that these things would happen. So we're not inventing something, but there is a very big difference between having the separation that we have during the Ghaiba from the guidance of the Imam in his teaching of Islamic principles and in his governing, and in cutting it off 250 years prior at the passing of the Prophet. And that is in the preparation that the Imams were able to carry out during this period. So I indicated some of it yesterday as well. But if you imagine at the end of the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had just barely lifted a people out of illiteracy and all of these Jahili customs that we know about from the time before Islam. Right? He had just barely gotten them out of that kind of culture where they're killing their daughters because of questions of honor, where they are eating things that don't deserve to be eaten. They're worshipping gods of their own fashioning and mistreating women and oppressing people and fighting for no reason and arrogant in their tribalism and so many other flaws that were a huge part of the fabric of society. He's barely gotten them out of that. And just think of literacy itself, where we know that people were primarily illiterate in Mecca and Medina. The people who were literate at the advent of Islam were just a handful, and even by the end of the Prophet's lifetime, it probably wasn't much better than that. At that time, at that point, if we were to cut off guidance, there's not yet even a culture of scholarship. There's not yet even a culture of writing and books. The script of Arabic has barely even gotten past the stage of cuneiform. It's basically still marks without dots, without vowels. It can barely be read, and it's only there as a reminder for someone who already knows what it's saying to be able to say that now I can remember what I'm supposed to be saying because of these marks that are on the papyrus or on the scroll, on the parchment. Right? But there's no culture of writing. People don't have libraries. They don't have books. In fact, after one of the travesties that occurred after Saqifa and the governments that took over after the Prophet's demise is that writing of the prophetic teachings of ahadith was prohibited. And for a whole century, people were not allowed to write anything but the Quran. That's a whole century where generations are passing who might have remembered something of what the Prophet said. And they never recorded it. At most, they passed it on by word of mouth. And through that system, much was lost. There was much room for addition and corruption as well. So in that kind of a situation, if we're to cut off ourselves from guidance, not much is left. So much can be lost. Right? You can imagine if you were to think of what would have happened if Imam Hussein had not been there, if he had not done what he did to call out Yazid for who he was, right? The kind of Islam that would now be there would not even be recognizable. It would be something that had started with the corruption of Yazid, and who knows where it would have ended up today. Right? So the point is that to cut ourselves off from divine guidance through the Imam at the time of the Prophet's death would have left us with almost nothing. Perhaps we would have had the Quran still, but we would have had very little else in terms of ahadith that were preserved, in terms of any sort of explanation of what the Quran was, in terms of how to implement that and bring that into our lives. And it's only through the preparation that the Imams themselves were able to implement during that 250 years from the demise of the Prophet until the Ghaiba Kubra starts, that we now have a system of scholarship. We have a whole rank of people amongst the Ummah who are scholars, who are spending their entire lives recording and disseminating and discussing and reflecting upon the teachings of the Prophet and the Imams. We have people who are now at the level of jurists who have enough training from the Imam, enough knowledge from the Imam, that they are now able to use the principles that the Imam has given them to apply past teachings through those methodologies to new situations. Right? So this happened because of the training of the Imams. And we shouldn't think that the situation that we now have in the Ghaiba is anything like what we would have had if we had cut ourselves off from that guidance at the time of the Prophet's demise. Now, another question that we need to talk about is, what about this? Why do we have the Ghaiba in the first place? We talked about this yesterday. We said that there's a principle that as long as there are people, there will always be a hujjah. Right, this was one of those divine policies, a sunan ilahiyya, that Allah has decided that we need guidance and that He's always going to provide that guidance in the form of a hujjah. Right, so that's a principle that we have. I shared a hadith with you yesterday as well, which is one of many ahadith that talks about this principle. So that's on one hand. But now we see that we have a ghaiba in which we don't have access to the Imam's teaching or his governance, because he's not able to do either of those two things during the ghaiba. So what is it that made it so that Allah in reality suspended this one principle, that there should always be a hujjah on earth, in favor of this ghaiba? Now, sometimes we have what's called not a conflict of interest, but we have competing ideals or competing values, two things that are both important, both priorities in their own right, but they have relatively more or less priority when compared to each other. And if you're in a situation where you have to choose one or the other, then you have to see which of these two values is more important, and that has to be given precedence over the other. Right? A simple example of interactions between men and women. So skin-to-skin contact, touching a non-mahram of the opposite gender is prohibited, is haram, but saving the life of a person is wajib. And so if it comes to it, if the person's drowning, there's a woman drowning and I'm the only one who can save her, and I have to naturally touch her and grab her to be able to save her life, then the value of saving her life is a higher value of greater precedence, and that should be given priority over the harm which will come of touching a non-mahram. Right? So when we have competing values, that is the principle that we use. And so here as well, we have two competing values. The need for continuous divine guidance is there. We don't suspend that. That's not now suspended in our current time. We still have that need. We see it desperately. We feel it desperately on a daily basis, that if only the Imam were here, think how the world would be now. So the need is still there. But something must be in play that makes it so that his ghaiba is even more important. And that's why Allah has for the time being, given precedence to the ghaiba and allowed us to be cut off from his obvious forms of guidance and governance, and instead he has, in the process, he has left us without that first principle, which is that there always should be a hujjah amongst us. So we need to understand or try to think of what's the reason for this. What has made the ghaiba necessary so that Allah gives precedence to that currently and is willing to suspend or to put on hold the other value of continued guidance. Now when we ask this question, it's always a tricky question where we try to think about why things happen. Right? Why does God do things? Why does He decide things? Because in reality, we don't always know why God does things. What we do know for certain is that Allah does everything with wisdom. He does everything purposefully. That everything that He does and decides is the best thing possible. So we know those things without a shadow of a doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But we don't always know exactly what that cause is, what that reason is, what the wisdom is behind the decisions that Allah makes. Sometimes He discloses them for us. Sometimes He tells us that the reason for this rule or the reason for this event is such and such, and He kind of moves the curtains away, moves the veils away, and allows us to see the wisdom behind it. And it reaffirms the confidence that we have that all of Allah's actions are purposeful and wise and good. But sometimes He doesn't. Sometimes He doesn't tell us what the reason is. And in that case, our duty is first and foremost to submit. If we know that the information is coming to us through an authentic source, we're confident in the source, but we don't know the reason behind it, then we submit to it despite the fact that we don't have knowledge of the reason. But sometimes what we can do is we can guess at some of the wisdom behind things. Usually in our in Islamic scholarship, we'll use the terms illah for the root cause of why God does something, why He decides something. And we'll use the word hikmah for a wisdom, not exactly a corollary, but some benefit that is derived from the decision, but not necessarily the root cause. So it could be that the wisdom is there in all cases. It could be that it's only there in some cases, and sometimes the wisdom's not there, but that doesn't change the fact that the decision is still the decision. Because the decision is based on some root cause, which is always there, and is exactly the reason why Allah has decided something. So even if we don't know the actual reason for why Allah does something, we still do have access sometimes to the wisdom behind it, the benefits of that decision. Either we can guess it based on what we know about how Allah works, what else He has taught us, or we can even experience what the benefit is. He's made some decision and we see that there are certain ramifications that are positive for our human life, our human existence, and so we can guess that one of the reasons why Allah has made something so is because of this benefit that we are now deriving from it. All right, so when we ask for what's the reason behind some decision Allah makes, we have to keep all of this in mind. We have no right to question Allah. La yus'alu amma yaf'alu wa hum yus'alun. Allah is not to be questioned about what He does. We're the ones to be questioned. So we can't demand an answer, say, tell me why you do this. If you don't tell me, I'm not going to obey. That's not our role. Our role is to say, if you tell me something, I'm going to obey. I'm going to submit because I know who you are. Not in blind, it's not blind because I know who He is. If I didn't know who He was, if there's no authenticity to the information I'm getting about what He's decided, that would be senseless and blind following of some idea. But when I know who He is, I know what kind of a God He is, I know the wisdom and the knowledge and all of those qualities in Him, and I receive information from Him through a valid source like the Prophet and like the Imam and like righteous transmitters that bring that information to me, then I submit not blindly, but because of all of those things. That's insight, that's wisdom on my part to submit where I should submit because it makes sense to submit because the source of the knowledge is from God Himself. So let's return to the question, why the ghaiba? Why has Allah decided that He'll put on hold the policy of continuously guiding people during this time of ghaiba? So what has made it so that the ghaiba needs to be there? And you can think, we have these 12 Imams. why does it have to be 12? Right, why did it have to be that Allah decided that there would be 12 Imams? Why not, if it were the case that people were killing the Imams, right? Why not simply have a continuous chain of infinite number of Imams, or at least a very large number of Imams, one after the other, to continually come and give people a chance and keep teaching and keep doing the same thing? Why limit it to 12 that you then have to extend the life of the 12th one because there is no 13th? But that's really the problem that we have right now. If it had been that there's a continuous chain and it doesn't stop until finally the goal is achieved, then we would have no need for this ghaibah. Right? Now again, we don't know the reason for this. We don't know why Allah sent 124,000 prophets. Why out of those are there 313 who are messengers and 5 who are ulul azm min ar-rusul. We don't know why those particular numbers are there. We don't know why He chose 12. Right? Perhaps we can guess that these were the people who were qualified. Right? Because we know from ahadith that the selection of these individuals as divine guides was not arbitrary. They didn't become virtuous because of their selection. Rather, they were selected because they were virtuous. There was something in them of servitude to Allah, of pursuit of truth, of submission to truth, of humility. There were characteristics within them that qualified them for Allah to then select them. Allahu a'lamu haythu yaj'alu risalata. He knows best where to plant, who to select and where to place that message that He wants to be conveyed to His creatures. So perhaps it was the case that these were the people who were qualified. There were only 12 to carry out this mission, or there's some other wisdom, some other reason why He decided on 12. But we can guess a little bit about why He might have made this decision. For one thing, knowing that there are 12 adds to the sense of urgency, because in the time of the Prophet and the Imams, they didn't, even though there were prophecies that there would be a ghaibah and that one of the ghaibahs would be long, I don't think from what we know about what happened during the ghaibah and how confused people were, they didn't have the expectation that this would be thousands of years. They expected it to be within 12 lifetimes, within 12 generations. Maybe a little bit longer, maybe there'd be some delay, but they didn't have an expectation that it would be thousands of years, as it already has been almost 1.5 millennia. But having that sense of urgency is important. Allah doesn't want it to be that I'm going to keep on sending guides until you finally get your act together, until you finally submit. It could be 12, it could be 1,000. And whenever you get your act together, it's on your time that I will work, not on my time. Rather, He says, no, you have 12 chances, right, to get everything together, to finally submit and establish the government of justice that is destined for this line of guides. And so it gives a sense of urgency to us that this has to happen soon, and so we have to change ourselves within a certain time frame. These 12 Imams had laid sufficient groundwork, and they had done their job sufficiently, and it was enough to prove that people were not ready. Right? Within 12 generations of Imams, not exactly 12 generations, but within these 12 Imams, we see that each one of them, مَا مِنَّا إِلَّا مَقْتُولٌ أَوْ مَسْمُومٌ, every single one of them was killed either by the sword or by poison. Right? So people were not ready to have them establish the kind of system of justice that was destined. They insisted on following their own desires, and they rose to the level of rebellion against God and even killed the Imams. So Hujjah was complete, right? A sufficient notice was given to people through 11 Imams, and there was no need to extend that number to some higher number or to an infinite number, but rather the 12 was sufficient to let us know that we don't have sufficient preparation. And now it's really, the ball is in our court as humanity, as an ummah, to prepare ourselves so that we can then be proper supporters of Him, and then He can do what He is supposed to do. All right, so that helps us to understand maybe a little bit about why it's 12, and because it's 12, that's why we have the ghaibah. But the question still lingers: why is why was there a need for the ghaibah? Right? Why did Allah decide? What influenced him? Not influenced him in that way, I'll speak in an anthropomorphic way, but what influenced him, what caused him to decide that the ghaibah was necessary and that he would be willing to suspend that principle of divine guidance. So we have a couple of things that come in traditions to help us to understand this question. One sentiment that we have is that this is not something that we have access to or that we are allowed to be privy to. Right? Kind of that same principle of la yus'alu amma yaf'alu wa hum yus'alun. Right? We have no right to ask, to question God about what He does. We're the ones who are to be questioned. I'll share one hadith with you. This is from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam. He said, "Inna li sahibi hadha al-amri ghaybatan la budda minha." He says that the one who will be the standard bearer, the master of this affair of tashayyu and wilaya, will necessarily have a ghaibah. يَرْتَابُ فِيهَا كُلُّ مُبْطِلٍ, during which ghaibah, every person who is of false belief and has false intentions will fall into doubt. فَقُلْتُ لَهُ وَلِمَا جُعِلْتُ فِدَاكَ. The person who is in the audience there, he asks Imam as-Sadiq, why is this the case? Now, from the continuation, it seems like maybe his question was about why is it necessary for the ghaibah to happen? Or why is it that people will go astray and fall into doubt because of this ghaibah? It seems like maybe that's the question, because he repeats the question again and the Imam gives a different answer the second time. قَالَ لِأَمْرٍ لَمْ يُؤْذَنْ لَنَا فِي كَشْفِهِ لَكُمْ. The Imam responds that the reason for this, whatever he's asking about from the previous sentence of the Imam, we have not been given permission to disclose this to you. فَقُلْتُ فَمَا وَجْهُ الْحِكْمَةِ فِي غَيْبَتِهِ. What's the wisdom behind his ghaibah? Right? It seems like he's asking the same question, but now he's asking about the wisdom behind the ghaibah of the Imam. Why is it that he's going to have this ghaibah? The Imam says, وَجْهُ الْحِكْمَةِ فِي غَيْبَتِهِ وَجْهُ الْحِكْمَةِ فِي غَيَابَاتِ مَنْ تَقَدَّمَهُ مِنْ حُجَجِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى ذِكْرُهُ. He says that the wisdom behind his ghaibah is the same as the wisdom behind the ghaibahs of all of the hujjaj of Allah who were ghaib in their own time and in their own way. I mentioned yesterday, Sheikh Saduq has compiled all of these stories and references of the ghaibah, the absence of other prophets and awsiya from their people. And so this hadith of the Imam indicates the same thing. Perhaps was an inspiration for Sheikh Saduq to write his book. إِنَّ وَجْهَ الْحِكْمَةِ فِي ذَلِكَ لَا يَنْكَشِفُ إِلَّا بَعْدَ ظُهُورِهِ. He says that the reason why he is in the ghaibah will not become clear, will not be disclosed until after he appears, after his advent. كَمَا لَا يَنْكَشِفُ وَجْهُ الْحِكْمَةِ لما أتاه الخضر عليه السلام من خرق السفينة وقتل الغلام وإقامة الجدار لموسى على نبينا وآله وعليه السلام إلا وقت افتراقهما. He says it's similar to how the wisdom behind the actions that Khidr took in his interactions with Musa, where he punched a hole in a boat and he killed a young boy and he erected or renovated a wall without taking pay for it. He did these actions in the presence of Musa, and these were mysteries to Musa. He didn't understand why he did these things. What's the reason for it? And in that circumstance, Khidr alayhi salam did not disclose what the reason for his actions was until they finally were to part. And he said, هَذَا فِرَاقُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنِكَ. إن هذا الأمر أمر من أمر الله وسر من سر الله وغيب من غيب الله. Right? The reason for this ghaibah is one of God's commands. This is one of His secrets. He says, وَمَتَى عَلِمْنَا أَنَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ حَكِيمٌ صَدَّقْنَا بِأَنَّ أَفْعَالَهُ كُلَّهَا حِكْمَةٌ. When we know that Allah is Hakim, that He's wise, then we affirm absolutely, categorically, that every one of his actions is based on wisdom. It is, in fact, wisdom embodied, he says. It's hikmah itself, not just hakim. Right? That's the principle I was talking about before. Once we know God is wise in all of his actions, he never does anything purposelessly, foolishly, or any of those sorts of things, then we can say categorically that every single action that God does, every single decision he makes is with wisdom. Now, do we understand the wisdom or not? Not necessarily. وَإِنْ كَانَ وَجْهُهَا غَيْرَ مُنْكَشِفٍ لَنَا. Now, even if the wisdom itself is not apparent to us, but because we know this is God's decision, certainly we know that it must be wise, certainly as well. So this hadith tells us that whatever the reason is behind the ghaibah is not something that we that we as the Ahlul Bayt are allowed to disclose to you. We do have other hadith where they do tell us some of the reasons, some of the wisdom behind it. So how can we understand the interaction between this hadith and the ones I'm going to share with you shortly? Perhaps this in this hadith, the Imam is saying that root cause, the reason why God decided on the ghaibah is something that we're not going to disclose to you. But the benefits, or the not the benefits, but some of the kind of auxiliary reasons, those hikam that are behind the decision, those we can disclose to you. Perhaps that's what he's saying. Or this first hadith is saying, you have no right to ask. He's just shutting that, he's nipping in the bud, shutting that door that you have no right to ask such a question. You should submit to the ghaibah because you know that this is God's decision and everything God does is wise, without the need to know what that reason is. Right? So maybe he's doing that, and then in other circumstances, based on whatever decision, whatever judgment that the Imams made, that the person was of a different caliber or had a different mindset or whatever, they decided to disclose some of those auxiliary reasons for why the ghaibah occurred. We have another, so that's one set of ahadith that we have about why the ghaibah happened, that it's not something that, it's above your pay grade and you shouldn't ask this. A second tradition tells us that the reason why Allah decided on the ghaibah was to test us, to test our resolve and our patience. I'll share a hadith with you from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. قال للقائم منا غيبة أمدها طويل. He says that the qa'im from amongst us will have an occultation, a ghaibah, whose duration will be long. كأني بالشيعة يجولان جولان النعم في غيبته يطلبون المرعى فلا يجدونه. He says, I can see it now, I can see the vision of our Shia who are wandering around as almost like cattle looking for fodder but not finding it during this ghaibah. ألا فمن ثبت منهم على دينه ولم يقس قلبه لطول أمد غيبة إمامه فهو معي في درجة يوم القيامة. He says, know that anyone among them who holds firm to his faith during that time and doesn't allow his heart to become hard, which is a term that's used to refer to a sense of impatience with the decision of Allah, the decree of Allah. That he's taking too long, I don't have time for this, I'm impatient about it. That's referred to as hardening of the heart. Who doesn't allow his heart to become hard through impatience because of the length of the ghaibah of his Imam, then that person is with me at my station on the Day of Judgment. Right, so here the Imam mentioned, or he indicates that one of the reasons why this ghaibah is there is to test us, to give us an opportunity to exercise and first develop and then exercise patience, to remain steadfast in our beliefs, in our intidhar, in our awaiting of our Imam, without allowing doubt and weakness of resolve and these kinds of things to creep in. A third reason that's given in some ahadith is that the ghaibah allows our Imam to be free of any sort of obligation to any government. Right, so let me read the hadith and I'll try to explain it in a way that I think makes sense. The hadith says, أَمَّا عِلَّةُ مَا وَقَعَ مِنَ الْغَيْبَةِ فإن الله عز وجل يقول يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تسألوا عن أشياء إن تبد لكم تسؤكم. So in this case, the Imam refers to this verse which says, don't ask about things that if they're disclosed to you, they will annoy you or bother you. إنه لم يكن لأحد من آبائي إلا وقد وقعت في عنقه بيعة لطاغية زمانه. He says, this is Imam Mahdi himself speaking, Ajjallahu ta'ala faraja. He says, every single one of my forefathers was under the yoke of an allegiance that he had to give to whichever government was ruling over him. Right? He had to pay allegiance, he had to be a citizen of those states, he had to make certain compromises because of whatever kind of whatever wisdom or whatever reason that there might have been, but he had to make compromises because of these governments that were ruling over him. وَإِنِّي أَخْرُجُ حِينَ أَخْرُجُ وَلَا بَيْعَةَ لِأَحَدٍ مِنَ الطَّوَاغِيتِ فِي عُنُقِي. But he says, when I rise up, when I set out for my revolution, I will have no such burden of a covenant or an agreement on my neck. The best way I can understand this is if you think of, the commitment that people like this have to their word. When their word is given, they stick by it. Even if they're forced to give a bay'ah or circumstances compel them to enter into an agreement, they take awfu bil uqud seriously. If this is a covenant, an agreement, a contract that I've agreed to, then I'm going to hold fast to it. Even if it's not just, even if it's not right, but if I'm to go against it, it sends the wrong message and people say that I have betrayed a trust, then I'm not going to betray it. So I think one of the instances from Islamic history that helps us to understand this is the time of Imam Hassan and Hussein alayhim as-salam, and when they had the truce with Muawiyah. Right? So because of that truce, even though the truce was immediately trampled by Muawiyah and disregarded by Muawiyah, but he didn't disregard it in a way that was clear, and in the public eye at least, it wasn't clear enough to people that if the Imam Hassan or Imam Hussein was to go against it, they would say the fault is all Muawiyah's and not Hassan and Hussein's. Right? So because that was the case, because they had signed this agreement and they had agreed to certain terms, and at least in the public eye, Muawiyah had also upheld those terms, they also upheld the terms. Right? And so we have 20 years almost when both of these Imams, they hold fast to the terms, they don't rise up against the government, they basically abide by all the terms that were agreed to. It's only when Yazid comes to power, and at that point it becomes obvious and clear for everyone that one of the terms that was important, that was in the truce, which was that Muawiyah would not appoint his own successor, when that's clearly broken, at that point Imam Hussein now says, since he has clearly and openly disregarded this truce, now I'm free of it as well. Right? So that kind of commitment that they had to abiding by this truce, which was clearly a compromise, was clearly They could have, they probably wanted to, do so many things against Muawiyah during that time, but they held their tongue, they abided by the truce during that period because they had agreed to it. So that kind of constraint that a truce, that being a citizen in a government brings, that's something that Allah wants Imam al-Hujjah to be free of. And so by being in the ghaibah, by living here but not living in a way that anyone recognizes him or knows him, he has no constraints on him from any governments of man. Another wisdom of the ghaibah is simply that if the Imam were living amongst us in an obvious way, then people would kill him. This is not exactly a hadith, but Zurara ibn A'yan, he himself says, إِنَّ لِلْقَائِمِ غَيْبَةً قَبْلَ ظُهُورِهِ قُلْتُ وَلِمَا قَالَ يَخَافُ الْقَتْلِ. So he says that, he reaffirms what he learned from Imam as-Sadiq that the Imam will have a ghaiba before he appears, and when he's asked, why is this the case? His response is because he fears being killed. Right? And we see that this is not a fear that's without reason. All of his forefathers, مَا مِنَّا إِلَّا مَقْتُولٌ أَوْ مَسْمُومٌ, all of his forefathers were killed, and there was every indication that if his whereabouts were known, then he also would be killed. Efforts were made in a grand way to try to find him, to try to find his mother, to try to make sure that he wasn't born, or if he was born, that he would be killed in his infancy. And so through the ghaiba, Allah has basically protected the Imam from that kind of end. Another reason why we can think of the ghaiba happening, why Allah would have decided on it, is because we're not ready. Right? Those previous 11 Imams did everything right on their part. Nonetheless, increasingly, with increasing severity at increasingly young ages, the governments of their time assassinated them. Right? So neither were the governments ready to accept this, neither were people ready to support them in a way that they could viably launch a revolution and establish this government of justice. And so while people are not ready, then because Allah has decided that there are going to be 12, we're not ready, then He has to extend the life of this 12th Imam and protect him through the ghaiba, test us through the ghaiba. So all of these things work together to influence this decision. Again, I say influence and cause through anthropomorphism. Of course, these things don't affect Allah's decision, but it's the way we can understand what He does. Now, there are a couple of other things that we can also add to this. These are not based on ahadith, but again, just thinking of the situation, knowing that this is the case, that there is the ghaiba, we are now in that ghaiba, Allah has already decided it, we can then try to think, well, what is the benefit that we derive from knowing it's a ghaiba, as opposed to thinking that he's not born and that he will be born in the future? How is this different that we're in a time of ghaiba, as opposed to our Sunni counterparts who are not in this situation? So knowing that he exists, that he's already there, he's already an adult, he's ready to go, and all of the obstacles are from us, increases our sense of urgency. Right? We have in many ahadith that the benefit that we derive during the ghaiba from the Imam is the benefit that we derive from the sun when it's behind the clouds. And if you think of that metaphor, one of the aspects of that metaphor is that when the sun is there, it's already shining, it's already day, it's shining brightly, but it's just the cloud that's stopping the sunlight from coming to you. If you're waiting for that sun to shine on you, you know that it's just a matter of time before that cloud moves and you get a glimmer of the sun. Right? So that sense of urgency is heightened greatly by the fact that He is present and ready and waiting, and all of the obstacles are actually on our part and not on His. As opposed to a system where if you think that he will be born at some time and then he'll have a normal lifespan and he'll have to grow to a certain age, and then once he's an adult, then things will happen. The anticipation of that is much more diluted than the anticipation in this kind of system. Again, I'm not saying this is the reason why Allah has designed it like this. I'm simply saying this is one of the benefits that we derive from the decision that Allah has already made. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the wisdom behind the benefit that we can derive from an Imam who's in the ghaiba. I was hoping to get to that today, but we've run out of time. So that will be our opening discussion for tomorrow. So just to set the stage for it, we have now established that there is a ghaiba. There is an occultation for this Imam. We have no doubt in that. That's not an obstacle to our belief in the Imam. But the question still remains, if the Imam is in occultation and the Imam's major role is to teach Islam and to govern, well, those are two things he cannot do during the ghaiba. So is there any benefit in his existence? And can we expect anything? Can we notice anything that's different because he exists, as opposed to a system in which he didn't exist and he would be born at some later time? So that inshallah we'll discuss tomorrow to see what are the other roles that the Imam plays besides these two that we've talked about until now. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. We ask you especially on this night, which is the eve of the 15th of Sha'ban, which in addition to the inherent virtue of the day is also additionally graced by the anniversary of the birth of our 12th Imam, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. We ask you, Allah, to shower your mercy on the entire ummah of the Imam who is waiting for him. We ask you to hasten his advent. And we ask you to, through your grace and through his barakah, lift from us all the hardships, especially the sickness that has now taken over the entire world. Hasten his advent. Let us be part of his movement. Let us be his servants. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi.
Assalamu alayka یا حجت الله فی ارضه السلام علیک یا عین الله فی خلقه السلام علیک یا نور الله الذی يهتدي به